In the past, I've shown some of my bike fitting process, but I wanted to share a bit more and go into some of the data and decision making. I thought that might be helpful for people that maybe you're experiencing some of the same things as some of my clients, and you can understand some of the reasoning. You might be able to help figure out your situation a little bit. In this bike fit, this was a client that came in. He was an elite college athlete, and his main problems, what we do is initially just kind of get the lay of the land with just a basic history. And he was having initially some discomfort and tightness behind both knees and towards the outer aspect or lateral aspect of the knees on both sides. He was also on long rides experiencing some hand numbness as well as some saddle irritation and numbness as well. But most pressing for this client as a racer was he didn't feel like he could generate as much power as he should when he was in his drops. And he did have a couple of things from his basic screening of his medical history that stood out. He did have chondromalacia, which is some subpatellar or under the kneecap issues a few years ago, but it's all pretty much resolved at this point. And a couple of years ago, he was involved in a bike crash and fractured some thoracic vertebrae. But he's all healed up from that as well. Off the bike, when I tested him for his movement screening, what stood out the most was he was restricted through his hips and through his spine, especially the lumbar spine, into rotation and in flexion. And it was remarkable for his age because he's fairly young, and I would say he was moderately restricted given his age, but also it was the quality of the movement that he had. How the joints moved through the range wasn't as smooth as I would hoped it would be. So of course we start him up on the bike with the infrared and the saddle pressure analysis, and we go through sort of a first round of data where I take measurements on both sides, of course. And the first round of data showed some good and some bad, as usual. And to start off, that was good. His knee extension, which is kind of an indicator, one of the first places we look to for saddle height, which is kind of a good place to start with a bike fit. His knee extension was good on both sides. It was actually pretty well in range. He was about 38 degrees from full extension. And more importantly is he was even on both sides. He was 38 degrees on both sides, which is not always the case. I know many times people expect it to be, but more often than not, people actually have a different knee extension one side to the other. And this is sort of our first indication that the person might not be sitting square on their saddle, which also is often the case, more often than not, that someone is sitting skewed or off to one side on the seat. But he was in pretty good shape, and this was confirmed, his knee extension being equal. This was kind of confirmed with some of the other measurements that we get, that his hip and pelvic movement was also pretty even. We can measure this through the saddle pressure, which is very easy. You can see here that he has fairly equal pressure right to left, a little bit more on one side, but that's not terribly uncommon, as I said. But he's sitting fairly even. Another way we can do it is we can look at some of the infrared measurements. We can look at hip vertical and lateral motion. So we get to see if there's a difference one side to the other. And additionally, we can take measurements from say the wrist to the hip. Now we know the wrists are going to be in the same position. So if there's a horizontal measurement difference on the right and the left side between the hip and the wrist dots, then we know that it's likely due to the hip dot being in a different position on one side versus the other. And so this, again, points towards the hips sitting a bit skewed on the saddle. But again, he was in pretty good shape, pretty even. The things I did not like were two main things. I would have preferred to see his hips behind his feet more. His hips seemed to be a little further forward than expected. His hips were also, and his pelvis was also sitting too forward on the saddle. He was even on the saddle, but he was also slid forward to the middle or the front of the saddle where he was bearing the majority of his weight. I would have preferred him to be a little further back. And additionally, I think that his shoulder angle, his upper body was a bit closed off. His shoulder angle was only 70 degrees. And this is, I think, part of the problem that he was experiencing with his inability to feel like he was generating power in the drops. When he has this level of of shoulder angle, it doesn't really allow him to stretch out enough and activate an important muscle on the back and through the shoulder called the lats, or our lat muscles, or latissimus. We really use these to stabilize the spine since they originate on the spine, and we use these to sort of leverage the upper body to help the lower body. Ask any Nordic skier or rower, and the lats they'll tell you are exceptionally important in being able to kind of generate more power, and this is no different on the bike. So we can't deal with all these problems at once, and it's important to note that two of these problems are sort of at odds with one another, meaning a lot of times, or in historically many times, the solutions to two of these problems are kind of the opposite. For instance, his hips being too far forward on the saddle, his pelvis being too far forward on the saddle. This is often, many times, this can be corrected, or in some cases, by just getting the saddle underneath the rider a little bit more. And so just by moving the saddle forward, we might be able to, we can often make that saddle more comfortable in some cases. But in this case, if we move the saddle forward, it may help with where he's sitting on the saddle, but it's definitely going to make the distance between his hips and his feet even worse. He's going to put his hips too far, again, even closer to being on top of his feet, and we don't want to do that. Also, from the upper body standpoint, we want to sort of stretch his upper body out a little bit and let him stretch a little bit more. And moving the saddle forward is not going to do that. We're trying to stretch him out to activate those lats, so we want to open up his shoulder angle. But again, moving the saddle forward kind of does the opposite of that. So we have to kind of go about this methodically and carefully, because this is where you can get into a lot of trouble when you're doing a bike fit. So the first problem I decided we would deal with would be his hips relative to his feet. I wanted to correct some of that first. And when I looked at, so what I did is I had him take his shoes off, and we looked at his cleats, and this is how they were positioned. And you can kind of see, based on the bolt pattern, that his cleats were a little further forward on the shoe. So I decided to pull those back a little bit. Pulling them back does a couple of things. It kind of kills a couple of birds with one stone for us. Pulling the cleats back moves the foot forward, and so already it's moving the hips further back behind the feet. So that's a good thing, for one. Additionally, what it does is it can take some of the strain off of the calf muscles and the distal hamstring muscles. Because we're shortening that lever through the foot, that it doesn't require as much from the muscles behind the knee, and so we might reduce some of that strain that he was experiencing back there. So there were some things I expected to see on this follow-up round of data. Now, we don't always, I can't take that for granted, so I wanted to retest him just to make sure that he adapted the way I sort of expected him to. We got him on the bike and retested, did a full set of data again, and luckily it showed exactly kind of what I was hoping. It did show that his knee extension got a little bit straighter at the bottom of the pedal stroke, and incidentally his ankle motion increased as well. But it did draw his hips forward on the saddle. Now, I expected his knee extension to get a little bit straighter because when we pull the cleats back on the shoe, we're effectively shortening his leg. If we shorten his leg, there's got to be more knee straightening in order for him to be able to reach his pedals. That's one of the things I was waiting for, and I was worried about his hips drawing forward on the saddle further. And the reason they did this is because when I shortened his leg and we made him extend a little bit more, this effectively made his saddle too high, and so it drew him forward further in order to try and shorten that reach to the pedals. So this is kind of the point I wanted to get to. So we brought the cleats back, and this has another benefit in that because bringing the cleats back, once we then get the saddle height set correctly, which that's where we're headed next, it allows the person to bear better weight through their feet. And that often helps us take care of some of the problems having to do with the pressure on the saddle. But I'm getting ahead of myself there just a little bit. So now the main problem is that it is just a little bit too much saddle height. So what I did is I lowered his saddle 5 millimeters, but I also took this opportunity to bring the saddle back a few millimeters. I wanted to get a little bit more insurance on getting his hips behind his feet and giving him the ability also to maybe stretch out just a little bit more. Now, we didn't move a ton, but being able to start moving a little bit was helpful. So after lowering the saddle and moving it back, we did another round of data, and we got his knee extension, how much his knees straightened, back to his baseline level where he came in, which I think was probably a good level for him. He's back to 38 degrees from full extension. And interestingly, his hips actually moved back more on the saddle and relative to his feet. We were able to get him to stretch out just a little bit more, so he was stretched through his upper body just a little bit more. We got his hips behind his feet, but it actually improved his saddle pressure. And again, that had to do with, I believe, the fact that we got, by getting the cleats back, and then we got the saddle height set correctly. Now he's bearing better weight through his feet, which allows the pelvis to then remain stable on the saddle. Additionally, when we get the hips behind the feet, something really interesting happens at the pelvis, and I've gone over this before. I call it Newton's second law of motion for cycling, and it has to do with, because our feet are now in front of us more, and they're below us when we're on the bike. When we push on the pedals, they push back, and if our feet are in front of us, then that means pushing down on the pedals is like pushing forward, and so the pedals are pushing back. And that pushes and stabilizes our pelvis on the saddle. And this is a big element of what happened for him. We got his hips far back enough where then he was able to stabilize that pelvis, which improved his saddle pressure, started to move it back just a little bit. Through all this, we're actually lengthening his position at the same time, which is kind of remarkable because, like I mentioned at the beginning, these things were at odds with each other and wouldn't normally remedy themselves with one set of fixes. So we got him to a pretty good place, and he actually mentioned, unprompted, he actually said as we were running through our last segment of data that he felt better on the bike. I would never go off of subjective sort of praise from a client by itself, but when it's combined with some objective data showing that, hey, things are actually moving the way we wanted them to, then I know we're on the right track. But this isn't where this bike fit ends. He actually has some work to do off the bike. I mentioned that he does have some movement restrictions through his hips and spine, and so he's going to work on that off the bike. And now we don't need him to spend, and this is often the case, we don't need the rider to spend hours and hours working on flexibility every week. They don't need to do yoga for an hour a day, but a little bit of very focused work on where his restrictions are will go a long way. And so I gave him 3 stretches. They dealt with trunk and hip flexion, as well as hip and trunk rotation as well, and just to kind of work on his flexibility just a little bit in where his restriction was, and improve sort of the quality of that movement. Because as he improves that, it is only going to allow him to then stretch out further, and the more he can stretch out, the more he can get his pelvis back on the saddle, onto the posterior section of the saddle, as well as the more he can stretch out and get his lats involved especially when he's in the drops. So that was, I know, a lot of information. Hopefully most of it made sense. If it didn't, don't hesitate to put something in the comments below. I'll be happy to answer any questions. And thanks for hanging in there, and we'll catch you on the next video.